A single Ukrainian MiG-29, two 250-pound guided bombs, no escorts, no backup squadrons, just a pilot, one reconnaissance drone, and a plan so precise it had less than 3 feet of error. Russian defenses bristled with radars and missiles, certain they could swat down any strike, but that confidence didn't last long. How could one fighter, flying alone, pick apart an entire Russian air defense screen and erase a command post at the heart of their drone war? The answer lies in minutes of planning and seconds of execution. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. From the roadside, it looked like nothing more than a shell of brick and concrete, sagging walls marked by years of shellfire and neglect. Windows were broken, doors hung loose, and the roofline sagged as if collapse was only a storm away. Villagers walked past without a second glance, thinking it was one of many ruined houses that dotted the front. What no one on the outside knew was that behind those fractured walls, Russia directed one of its most aggressive branches of the war. Banks of radios, digital screens, and a tightly wired maze of antennas had been hidden inside. Operators tracked the flight of drones across hundreds of kilometers, steering them toward targets in Kiev and pushing Lancet strikes against Ukrainian artillery positions. The structure functioned as the central switchboard of unmanned weapons in the area, yet outwardly it gave every sign of being long abandoned. That deception worked for months. Russian planners believed no surveillance team would bother charting a partially collapsed 2-story house when more obvious bunkers and depots demanded attention. They built blind confidence into that assumption, parking vehicles behind tree lines at night, installing cables under layers of soil, and reinforcing only the interior. What sat in plain view was camouflage by neglect. The more destroyed it looked, the more believable the cover. They assumed that their secret had dissolved into the texture of the local battlefield, invisible to watchful eyes. Ukraine, however, had begun to notice faint electronic whispers around the ruin. Signals intelligence teams detected irregular bursts of communication that never matched civilian chatter. To confirm suspicions, a small LEA-100 reconnaissance drone began circling high and silent above the building. Day after day, it recorded energy emissions, detected antennas hidden inside collapsed chimneys, and even measured vibrations that hinted at movement in separate rooms. Slowly, analysts pieced together a digital picture of the interior. Using returns gathered at different altitudes and hours, they built a 3-dimensional model of the floor plan, where operators moved, where computers hummed, where generators rumbled. Such mapping allowed an eventual strike to pinpoint the exact locations where staff clustered. Precision mattered more than weight of fire. Each new pass by the drone refined coordinates to within a single meter. Maps from satellites never reached such detail, but live orbiting footage gave a synchronized grid comparing windows, walls, and ground markings. By stacking these layers together, strike planners could feed flight computers the exact geometry of the house. The result was a kill plan defined not by estimated guesses but by measured data, eliminating uncertainty and overkill. The intelligence confirmed more than a command post. Inside that shell existed the hub that coordinated swarms of Shahed drones and Lancet missiles. This was not local control over a few missions. It acted as a nerve center serving several fronts, projecting Russian eyes deep into Ukrainian positions. Its collapse would blind artillery hunters, ground attack teams, and drone pilots who relied on continuous guidance. Neutralizing such a site meant knocking out the very system that allowed Russian formations to strike targets far from physical contact. The deception of a ruined exterior hid one of the most important digital brains in the theater. That is why the risk of an open-air strike became acceptable. Destroying the building would cripple coordination across a wide stretch of the war. Ukraine understood that flattening the ruin with precise bombs would achieve more than scattering rubble. It would silence the feeds that kept Russian drones airborne. The structure had become the enemy's central nervous system, and cutting it meant paralysis on multiple fronts. But finding the target was only half the challenge. Carrying a pair of precision bombs through one of the most heavily defended skies in Europe would test both pilot and machine in ways that left no margin for error. How does one fighter carve a path through an air defense system designed to stop dozens? That was the question hanging over the mission as a single MiG-29S prepared for launch. The choice of using one plane instead of several was deliberate. A formation would light up enemy radar maps instantly. One aircraft, by contrast, could slip into the clutter, riding the edge of detection and appearing as a faint echo rather than a clear threat. This was the gamble, and everything depended on how well the pilot could ride that margin. The aircraft itself carried a stripped yet specialized loadout. Extra fuel tanks extended its legs for both approach and escape. 2 defensive missiles offered only a last line of protection if something broke through. Fitted under the fuselage was an SPS-141 jamming pod, designed not to blind all radars, but to bend and distort key frequencies, enough to sow confusion in enemy tracking screens. Hanging on its pylons were the mission's real weapons, two GBU-39 small-diameter bombs. They weighed only a fraction of a standard air-dropped bomb, but their folding wings could glide dozens of miles once released. That meant the jet didn't have to pass directly over the target, but only within striking distance. Even so, getting to that distance required weaving through a net of overlapping radars and interceptor batteries. Russian crews had networked air search radars with smaller mobile systems. Panzer units with rapid-fire guns and missiles created the short-range shield. Above them were medium-range systems designed to strike targets climbing out of the terrain. On paper, it was a layered dome, tight enough to deny even advanced aircraft. Against one conventional jet, the plan looked suicidal. That was exactly why it worked. The Russians did not expect such a move. The pilot pushed the MiG into nap-of-the-earth flight, only about 165 feet above ground, moving at nearly 480 knots. At this altitude, tree lines, low hills, and even farm structures acted as shields against radar sweeps. The jet's path was planned with topographic data, hugging terrain that bent radar beams upward while leaving the fighter masked below. But radar energy still occasionally brushed the aircraft. Operators spotted partial traces, forcing the pilot to pop flares at intervals and deploy an AL-50 towed decoy trailing behind the jet. The decoy confused seekers by presenting a brighter electronic reflection than the MiG itself, luring missiles toward empty space. Ahead of the fighter, small decoy drones had already been launched to soak up Russian attention. These drones scattered false signatures, mimicking multiple aircraft approaching head-on. Operators in control centers suddenly faced screens filled with spurious contacts. To hedge bets, some fired Panzer missiles at the wrong returns, while others shifted radar frequencies in wasteful attempts to filter the noise. For a brief window, coverage folded in on itself. The MiG used that gap to edge closer, gaining the line it needed for weapon release. Electronic warfare and maneuver masked the approach, but precision now depended on timing. At 37 miles from the ruined house, the pilot aligned for release. Guidance kits inside each bomb calculated glide patterns to the exact coordinates modeled earlier by reconnaissance drones. Everything hinged on split seconds. Release them too early and they would fall short. Too late and they would drift wide. With counters ticking down, the aircraft lurched through its final climb, just enough altitude to give the bombs the arc they required. The weapons dropped 3 seconds apart. Wings folded out, steering fins locked, and both GBU-39s glided away on separate paths. Without need for further guidance, they carried themselves across the defended zone. Russian sensors, still chasing decoys, missed the true danger, skating silently above. When the bombs reached their programmed point, sub-meter accuracy brought both impacts straight into the hidden command house. The ruin folded inwards in a burst of dust, electronics, and broken concrete. What the Russians lost was more than a building. They lost a hub that had stitched together drones, missiles, and artillery across wide regions. In one morning, a single strike had blinded large formations. Their doctrine of centralized control suddenly collapsed, forcing crews to redeploy in scattered positions. A lone MiG-29 had just rewritten the balance of their air war. The strike proved that in modern war, information can outweigh explosives. 2 small guided bombs erased not only a building, but an entire nerve center directing drones and missiles across the front. The effect rippled far wider than rubble on a street. Russian crews were forced to scatter, dragging equipment into safer zones and breaking the concentrated control that made their drone war effective. Coordination slowed, morale weakened, and commanders learned that even the most ordinary ruin could be their undoing. One precise strike silenced hundreds of drones, showing that the battlefield is rewritten not by volume, but accuracy.